Picture France in the early 15th century. It was a land ravaged by endless military campaigns, gripped by famine and epidemics that claimed the lives of thousands. Cities and villages lay in ruins after fierce battles. Vast regions were occupied by foreign invaders, and hope for salvation barely flickered in the hearts of the exhausted people. Despair and hopelessness reigned everywhere. It was in this tragic moment that an extraordinary figure emerged onto the historical stage, seemingly straight from the pages of legends: Joan of Arc. A simple peasant girl, raised in a small village, barely literate and not yet 17 years old, suddenly declared that she heard divine voices of saints who were calling her to a sacred mission to save France from imminent destruction. She claimed that angels and archangels spoke to her with commandments, demanding that she drive the English from French soil and enthrone the rightful king. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. There are many more interesting videos waiting for you, and we will continue. As the 600th anniversary of her deeds approaches, the story of Joan of Arc continues to stir the imagination of people around the world. She has become a true legend, an embodiment of heroism, unwavering faith, and selfless sacrifice in the name of the highest ideals. But who was she really? What was this young woman like, who managed to lead armies of thousands, inspire monarchs to decisive action, and radically change the course of a bloody war that seemed destined to favor the enemy? In this narrative, we will try to comprehensively explore the phenomenon of Joan of Arc, to consider her personality from different angles. Was she a sincere saint, guided by divine providence and higher powers? Or was her image skillfully used in a complex political game by kings and high-ranking church officials pursuing their own selfish goals? Were her visions truly revelations sent from above? Or were they merely hallucinations, born of deep religious faith and intense stress caused by the tragic events of the time? Why, even centuries after her tragic death, does she remain one of the most enigmatic and inspiring figures in world history, arousing both admiration and controversy? Let us embark together on a fascinating journey through time to lift the veil of mystery surrounding the personality and dramatic fate of Joan of Arc, to try to understand the motives of her actions, the true reasons for her phenomenal success and her tragic end. To fully grasp the greatness of Joan of Arc's personality and achievement, it is first necessary to clearly understand the historical context in which she lived and acted. 15th century France was a country exhausted by a protracted and bloody conflict, known in history as the 100 Years' War, although in reality it was a series of military campaigns and truces. This war, which began in 1337 and lasted until 1453, that is, for 116 long years, became one of the most devastating and protracted conflicts in the history of medieval Europe. The causes of this large-scale confrontation were rooted in the complex issue of succession to the throne in France, which became the catalyst for a long-standing feud between the two largest European powers. In 1328, the French king Charles IV the Fair, the last representative of the glorious Capetian dynasty in the direct male line, died. Since he did not leave behind any legitimate sons as heirs, this immediately provoked a serious political crisis and exacerbated the power struggle between various claimants to the French throne. The English monarch Edward III, who was the grandson of the French king Philip IV the Fair through the female line, declared his rights to the French crown, claiming that he was the closest legitimate claimant to the throne of France. However, the French nobility and influential clergy categorically refused to recognize the right of inheritance to the throne through the female line, citing ancient Salic laws, according to which only men could inherit the throne, excluding women and their descendants. As a result of lengthy political intrigues and behind-the-scenes negotiations, a representative of the new Valois dynasty, Philip VI, who was the nephew of the previous king, was elected to the throne of France. Edward III, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of this decision, perceived it as a personal insult and a gross violation of his legitimate rights to the French crown. In 1337, he officially declared war on France, thus marking the beginning of a long and tragic period in the history of both countries. In the initial stage, the English were accompanied by military successes, winning one victory after another thanks to their superiority in military tactics and weapons. In 1346, in the bloody Battle of Crécy, English troops under the command of the talented commander Edward III inflicted a crushing defeat on the French army, which significantly outnumbered them. The English managed to win a convincing victory thanks to the high skill of their archers, armed with the famous longbows, whose arrows easily pierced the knightly armor of French warriors. This battle went down in history as one of England's most famous and significant victories in the 100 Years' War, demonstrating the weakness of the traditional French military strategy and the inability to resist the new methods of warfare used by the English. 10 years later, in 1356, the French suffered another tragic defeat in the Battle of Poitiers. Here, the son of Edward III, the celebrated commander Edward the Black Prince, once again defeated the French army and even managed to capture the French king John II, the Good himself. The captured monarch was taken to England, which was a huge humiliation and shame for all of France, plunged into chaos and despair. The country gradually plunged into the abyss of anarchy and lawlessness. Uprisings of peasants and townspeople discontent with the heavy burden of war and the arbitrariness of feudal lords broke out everywhere. The economy and economics completely collapsed, and trade practically ceased. Military operations continued with varying success and were repeatedly interrupted by temporary truces, which, however, did not bring long-awaited peace and tranquility. However, the decisive and crushing blow to the French state was struck in 1415, when the young and ambitious English King Henry V, at the head of an impressive army, landed in northern France and entered the famous Battle of Agincourt. Despite the significant numerical superiority of the French troops, the English once again won a brilliant victory, demonstrating more competent tactics of warfare, iron discipline, and high morale of their soldiers. After this most severe defeat, the French were morally broken and demoralized, and the country plunged into a deep crisis. English troops captured Paris, the capital of France, and occupied a significant part of the northern territories, establishing their control and order there. By this time, France was on the verge of complete disappearance as an independent state, and its political unity was under threat. Powerful provinces, such as Burgundy, which had significant autonomy and their own interests, began to act independently, often entering into alliances with the English against the central French government, seeking to benefit from the situation. The French king, Charles VI the Mad, suffering from a severe mental disorder, actually lost the ability to govern the state and make important decisions. The country was in a state of deep political chaos and lawlessness, which further aggravated the already difficult situation. Against the background of these catastrophic events, the common people of France experienced incredible suffering, hunger, and deprivation. The ongoing military operations led to the destruction of crops, the devastation of villages and towns, and caused outbreaks of epidemics that claimed the lives of thousands of people. Many peasants and townspeople lost their homes and property, were left without means of subsistence, and were forced to wander in search of food and shelter, replenishing the ranks of the poor and destitute. Poverty, disease, hunger, and constant fear for their lives and the lives of loved ones became an integral part of the daily life of ordinary French people. Far from major cities, in a picturesque area, among the endless meadows, dense forests, and rolling hills of Lorraine, was the small village of Domremy, almost untouched by the devastating consequences of the war, the hustle and bustle of the outside world. Here, people's lives flowed on, subject to natural cycles and the daily routine of hard rural work, not much different from what it was 100 or even 200 years ago. It was here, in a simple peasant family in 1412, that a girl was born, who was destined to go down in history under the name Joan. Her family, whose surname the whole world would later know as Dark, did not stand out among other residents of the village, but was respected for honesty, hard work, and integrity. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of stern disposition, straightforward, strict, but fair and honest. He cultivated a small plot of land, grew bread and vegetables, raised livestock, managed the household, and was sometimes elected village headman, enjoying the trust and respect of fellow villagers. Jacques strove to raise his children in a spirit of strict discipline, respect for hard work, and adherence to moral principles. There was no place for idleness and inactivity in his house. He did not tolerate laziness and always made sure that the children were engaged in useful activities and were taught responsibility. Jeanne's mother, Isabelle Romay, was the complete opposite of her husband, gentle, kind, warm-hearted, and deeply religious. It was she who, from Jeanne's earliest years, taught her and her siblings to pray, told them stories from the Bible, and raised them in a spirit of compassion and mercy towards their fellow human beings, instilling in them Christian values. Isabelle was not only the keeper of the home, but also the family's spiritual guide, their wise counselor and loyal friend. Thanks to her, the children grew up in an atmosphere of kindness, love and faith, learning patience and empathy for the suffering of others, which were so necessary in those difficult times. Jeanne, being the fourth child in the family, grew up surrounded by her brothers and sister, participating daily from early childhood in all family concerns and chores around the house and in the fields. She helped her mother cook, clean the house, wash clothes, and care for the domestic animals. When the girl grew a little older, her father began to trust her with more difficult work, caring for the livestock, harvesting crops, helping with field work. All this accustomed Jeanne to hard physical labor, responsibility, and independence. From her earliest childhood, neighbors and fellow villagers noticed her extraordinary seriousness, deep thoughtfulness, and surprising independence, especially for her young age. Jeanne never complained about difficulties and did not avoid work, always showing remarkable maturity and diligence in everything she was entrusted with. Unlike most of her peers, who after hard workdays gladly spent time socializing, playing games and dancing, Jeanne preferred quiet and solitude, avoiding noisy amusements. She often went beyond the outskirts of the village, where she would sit alone for a long time in thought or prayer, reflecting on eternal matters and seeking answers to the questions that troubled her young soul. This unusual behavior set her apart from the other residents of Domremy and made her the object of close attention and wonder from neighbors, who saw in her not just a strange and unusual girl, but a person with a special inner world, full of deep and not fully understood thoughts and feelings. Thus, the humble setting of the small village, the harsh daily life, the simple but firm morals of her father, and the tender religiosity of her mother laid the foundations of Joan of Arc's character and worldview, shaping her as a person. It was in this simple, even seemingly primitive rural environment that the girl grew and strengthened, who would soon lead an army of thousands and inspire an entire nation to a desperate struggle for its independence and freedom from foreign invaders. When Jeanne turned about 13 years old, her life suddenly and drastically changed in the most unexpected and unbelievable way, as if by the will of fate. One day, when she was in the garden near her house, the girl first heard mysterious voices, sounding as if from another world. This momentous event became a turning point in her life and destiny, predetermining her future path. Although at first Jeanne did not dare to tell anyone about it, fearing misunderstanding, mockery, and condemnation from those around her. According to Jeanne's own accounts, the first to appear to her in visions were Archangel Michael, the leader of the heavenly host, and Saints Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch, revered Christian martyrs. They appeared to her as bright, radiant figures, surrounded by a celestial glow and unearthly beauty. The voices of the saints were gentle, yet insistent and clear, like echoes of the divine will. They spoke to her in simple and understandable language, urging her to be devout, virtuous, and always follow the will of God, fulfilling His commandments and following the righteous path. But the most amazing and incredible thing was that after some time they informed her of her great mission, entrusted to her from above, to liberate France from English domination and help crown the rightful French king, Charles VII, in the ancient city of Reims, where French monarchs had traditionally been crowned. These mystical visions recurred regularly, sometimes several times a week, filling Jeanne's life with special meaning. Jeanne perceived them not as hallucinations, dreams, or the product of a wild imagination, but as completely real events happening to her in waking life. She felt chosen by God to fulfill an important mission, but at the same time, she was confused and even frightened by the enormous responsibility that suddenly and unexpectedly fell on her young shoulders. At first, Jeanne carefully concealed her visions from those around her, keeping them a deep secret. However, gradually, her behavior began to change, and the changes in her character and habits could not go unnoticed by those around her. If before she was just a quiet, modest, and serious girl, now she became even more withdrawn, pensive, and detached from worldly vanities. She could disappear from home for long periods, going into the dense forests or to a small village chapel, where she spent much time in solitary prayers and reflections on the meaning of life and her unusual mission. Relatives and neighbors initially treated the strangeness in Jeanne's behavior cautiously, but with patience and leniency, believing that these were temporary age-related peculiarities or manifestations of excessive piety. However, over time, her behavior began to cause them serious concern and sometimes even outright bewilderment, escalating into condemnation. People began to say behind Jeanne's back that she was strange, not like everyone else, and that something was wrong with her. Some fellow villagers, prone to superstition, even began to suspect that Jeanne was under the influence of evil spirits or was practicing witchcraft, that she was possessed by an unclean force. Ominous rumors spread through the village that the girl had lost her mind, that she could not be trusted, and that she posed a danger to those around her. The attitude towards what was happening in Jeanne's family was especially difficult and painful. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, a strict and down-to-earth man, accustomed to order and common sense, was deeply troubled by his daughter's strange behavior, considering her actions and words to be manifestations of dangerous pride, a morbid imagination, or even madness. He even said in despair that he would rather drown her with his own hands than allow his daughter to disgrace the good name of the family and the entire village with her ridiculous behavior. Jeanne's mother, Isabelle, although deeply disturbed by her daughter's condition, still showed more understanding and sympathy towards her, intuitively feeling that her daughter was experiencing something very important, deep, and perhaps even sacred. Nevertheless, despite the complex and ambiguous attitude of relatives and neighbors, the misunderstanding, condemnation, and even hostility from those around her, Jeanne never wavered in her beliefs and did not renounce her faith. She continued to firmly assert that the voices of the saints were real, that this was not a dream, not an illness, and not a product of her imagination, and that she was ready to go to any length, overcome any obstacles, to fulfill her destiny entrusted to her by God. It was this unwavering faith in her mission, her absolute conviction in the righteousness of her cause, and her ability to withstand the cruel pressure of those around her that set Jeanne apart from thousands of other village girls and laid a solid foundation for her incredible fate, which was soon to shake all of France and forever change the course of history. In the 15th century, the attitude of the Catholic Church towards mystical revelations and visions was quite complex and ambiguous, combining elements of both acceptance and cautious skepticism. On the one hand, the Church recognized the possibility of divine revelation and actively supported the cult of saints, many of whom claimed to receive revelations and prophecies directly from God or holy angels. Such prominent religious figures as Saint Catherine of Siena, famous for her mystical experiences, or Saint Bridget of Sweden, the founder of a monastic order, were considered respected and worthy of veneration, despite their unusual spiritual experiences and visions. On the other hand, the Church was always wary of the spread of false prophets, heresies, and sectarianism, which could undermine its authority, cause division among the faithful, or lead the flock astray. Any mystical revelation at that time was carefully examined and controlled by church authorities, who sought to separate true manifestations of divine grace from false or diabolical temptations. Usually, confessors or experienced theologians carefully studied the statements of people reporting their visions to determine their authenticity, compliance with the dogmas of faith, and the absence of signs of possession. A person speaking of mystical revelations had to show deep humility, sincere repentance for sins, complete submission to the Church, and demonstrate exceptional spiritual purity by leading a pious life. If the visions were accompanied by signs of pride, disobedience to spiritual authorities, or dubious moral actions, such people were quickly declared either possessed by demons, charlatans, or simply mentally ill. When Jeanne first spoke about her visions, many residents of Domremy and local priests received her words with great doubt and disbelief, not knowing how to react to her unusual claims. However, there were several important reasons why she was not immediately declared insane or a heretic and handed over to a church court. First, Jeanne's behavior was impeccable from the point of view of generally accepted Christian moral norms and religious rules. She was pious, modest, kind-hearted, regularly attended church, prayed diligently, and sincerely followed all religious canons without violating the commandments. She did not seek fame, did not demand special attention to herself, and showed no signs of pride, self-aggrandizement, or exaltation over others, which usually aroused suspicion among church authorities and could be interpreted as a manifestation of diabolical pride. Second, Jeanne spoke about her visions calmly, clearly, logically, and very convincingly, showing no signs of excitement or fanaticism. Her words were clear, coherent, and logical, unlike the rambling and nonsensical speeches of madmen, false prophets, or charlatans who were easily exposed as frauds. She recounted the minute details of her revelations with such plausibility and consistency that even seasoned confessors and erudite theologians could not immediately dismiss her claims as mere fabrication. Furthermore, the historical context and prevailing political climate played a significant role in how Joan was perceived. France was in a dire state, ravaged by war, and its people desperately yearned for a miracle, hoping for deliverance. The Church could not entirely disregard the public sentiment, especially when ordinary people began to see Joan as a potential savior sent by God to rescue France. Local priests themselves, and even some members of the higher clergy, secretly hoped that Joan's visions would prove genuine and help the country achieve long-awaited peace and political stability. Finally, both the Church and the secular authorities saw in Joan a potential political instrument that could be used to bolster the authority of King Charles VII and unite the divided nation against a common external enemy, the English. Had she been immediately declared insane or possessed by evil spirits, the unique opportunity to harness her influence and standing among the common people for political ends would have been lost. Therefore, instead of immediate condemnation and referral to a church court, it was decided that Joan should be thoroughly investigated, sending her for discussions with experienced theologians and scholarly clergymen, so that they could assess her mental state and the veracity of her revelations. She was subjected to rigorous and thorough interrogations, tests of her sincerity of faith, moral purity, and the conformity of her beliefs with the dogmas of the Catholic Church. When it became clear that Joan was successfully passing all these tests and giving clear, logical, and convincing answers to all questions, her mission was deemed worthy of attention and further study, allowing her to go to the Dauphin Charles, the future King of France, to personally present her arguments and convince him of her righteousness. Thus, the Church's attitude toward Joan and her revelations was initially cautious and wary, but gradually became more favorable. As a result of a deep analysis and comprehensive examination of her behavior, beliefs, and moral qualities, instead of accusing her of madness, heresy, or possession by evil spirits, the Church authorities effectively endorsed her mission, giving Joan the opportunity to become the remarkable figure who played a decisive role at a pivotal moment in French history. When Joan of Arc became fully convinced that her calling was to liberate France from foreign invaders and lead the Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir to the French throne, to a solemn coronation in Reims, she realized that the only way to fulfill this sacred mission was to go to him in person and convince him of her righteousness. This was an incredibly audacious and risky venture, seemingly impossible to achieve. A simple peasant girl, barely out of childhood, was about to meet in person with the highest representative of authority in the country, the future King of France, to convince him of her cause. Despite the apparent impossibility of this task, Joan was filled with unwavering determination and firm faith in her mission. She set out for the nearby fortified town of Vaucouleurs, where a garrison of French troops was stationed under the command of Captain Robert de Baudricourt, known for his severity, rational thinking, and practical approach to everything. He was a pragmatic, calculating, and extremely cautious man, and initially treated Joan with great skepticism, ridicule, and outright contempt, unwilling to waste his time on idle talk. Indeed, from the point of view of any reasonable person of that time, the idea of a young peasant girl claiming to be sent by God himself to save France from imminent destruction seemed utterly insane, absurd, and ridiculous. However, Joan was persistent and was not going to give up, ignoring the taunts and contempt. She began to visit Robert de Baudricourt regularly, insistently repeating her requests and confidently stating that she needed to meet with the Dauphin Charles as soon as possible to convey to him the will of God and save France from its enemies. Despite his initial categorical refusal, the girl stubbornly returned again and again, trying to convince him that she was indeed sent by God and that her mission was of great importance to the entire country. Her absolute confidence in her righteousness, simplicity, sincerity, and seriousness gradually began to impress the captain, making him ponder her words. Meanwhile, rumors about the strange peasant girl and her unusual mission began to spread rapidly throughout Vaucouleurs and the surrounding area, arousing keen interest and curiosity among the local residents. Ordinary people, desperately waiting for some kind of miracle, relief from their suffering, and deliverance from their enemies, began to support Joan, and some even saw in her unexpected appearance a good omen from God, a harbinger of imminent salvation. This growing public pressure and the sincere faith of the common people also played an important role in Robert de Baudricourt's final decision. The final decision came to him after Joan made a bold and completely unexpected prophecy that struck him to the core. She informed the captain of a major military defeat of the French troops near Orléans, which was not yet known in Vaucouleurs and was being kept top secret. A few days later, this tragic news was indeed confirmed, shocking Robert de Baudricourt and making him seriously consider Joan's words, realizing that she possessed some special gift of foresight. Now, astonished and somewhat bewildered, Robert de Baudricourt came to the conclusion that if Joan really possessed such a gift and was sent by God, then perhaps it was worth giving her a chance and helping her fulfill her mission. He agreed to send her to Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles VII was residing at the time, but he set several conditions that she had to meet. First, Joan had to travel under the reliable protection of experienced warriors to avoid attacks by robbers or enemy soldiers. Second, she had to dress in men's clothing for her own safety, so as not to attract unnecessary attention and avoid possible assaults on the road. Thus began her legendary journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon, predetermining the further course of French history. Together with a small group of loyal warriors and attendants, Joan set off on a long journey, full of dangers, difficulties, and uncertainties. Despite the justified fear of bandits, English and Burgundian soldiers who might be lying in wait for them on the roads, the girl remained calm and confident, convinced that God would protect her on this arduous journey and help her fulfill her sacred mission. After several days of arduous travel, bypassing hostile territories and avoiding dangerous encounters, Joan arrived safely in Chinon, where the Dauphin Charles was located. It was here that she would face her most important test and prove to the future king that she was sent by God himself to save France from imminent destruction. When Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon, the city and the palace were already filled with rumors about the unusual peasant girl who claimed that she was destined to save France from its enemies. Her arrival was surrounded by general curiosity, mixed with skepticism, distrust, and even outright ridicule. Some saw in her the last hope of the country, sent by God to save France, while others considered her merely a young dreamer, a deceiver, or worse, a cunning tool in the hands of enemies seeking to undermine the French state from within. For Charles VII himself, whose position was very precarious, the situation was particularly delicate and required a balanced approach. At that time, he was not yet the crowned King of France, and did not even control most of the country's territory. His power was unstable and surrounded by constant threats, conspiracies, and intrigues from enemies and ill-wishers. Dauphin Charles was experiencing agonizing doubts, tormented by fears and suspicions, and feared betrayal and conspiracies, which made him extremely cautious and distrustful of any new allies, especially such unusual and extraordinary ones as an illiterate peasant girl who claimed that saints and archangels appeared to her. That is why Charles VII and his closest advisors decided to organize a special and thorough test to determine the truth of Joan's intentions and to understand whether she could be trusted. On the evening of March 6, 1429, when Joan was invited to meet with Dauphin Charles, the palace was full of aristocrats, courtiers, soldiers, and servants. Instead of sitting in his usual place on a dais in the richly decorated throne room and donning royal robes, Charles decided to hide among his courtiers, arranging a kind of test for Joan. He was dressed in simple nobleman's clothing and was indistinguishable from the many other men surrounding him. Moreover, one of the close noblemen, specially dressed in royal robes and attributes of power, was placed in the Dauphin's seat of honor to mislead Joan and test her discernment. This test was a serious, cunning, and well-thought-out move designed to ascertain Joan's true intentions and abilities. If Joan had made a mistake and mistaken another person for the king, she could have been immediately sent back to the village, declared either insane, a deceiver, or a tool of the enemies. Charles VII and his inner circle wanted to be sure whether the girl was indeed endowed with some unusual gift, special knowledge, or discernment that would allow her to unmistakably recognize the real king among many other people. When Joan entered the huge hall of the castle, filled with people, she showed not the slightest confusion, hesitation, or embarrassment. Ignoring the figure seated on the throne and confidently bypassing him altogether, Joan walked directly into the heart of the crowd, precisely to the spot where the disguised Dauphin Charles stood, attempting to remain unnoticed. Then, with humility and assurance, she knelt before him, uttering words that stirred the souls of all present. "In the name of God, you are the true heir of France and the future king. It is you I must lead to Reims for the sacred coronation ceremony." According to eyewitness accounts, the Dauphin was taken aback by Joan's insight, though he tried to conceal it, maintaining an outward composure. He inquired of Joan how she had managed to identify him amidst the numerous courtiers, to which she replied that she was guided by the will of God and the precise instructions of the voices of saints, who directed her in all things. Contemporary accounts also state that Joan revealed to Charles something deeply personal, intimate and secret, known only to him, which definitively convinced the Dauphin that before him stood not an ordinary girl, but someone possessing a special gift, sent by God with an important mission. A curious historical fact lies in why Charles VII even decided on such an unusual test and took such a risky step. The reason was not only in his personal doubts, fears and suspicions, but also in the tense atmosphere of palace intrigues that prevailed at the time. By this time, many influential courtiers distrusted the Dauphin and did everything they could to discredit him in the eyes of society, spreading false rumors and weaving intrigues. Charles understood perfectly well that the appearance of such an extraordinary figure as Joan could become both a strong argument in his favor, strengthening his position, and a cunning trap set by his enemies to compromise him and strip him of power. By testing her in this way, he could simultaneously assure himself of her authenticity, verify her abilities, and demonstrate to his courtiers and political opponents that he was acting prudently, with reason and due caution. The success of this trial became a turning point not only for Joan of Arc herself, but for all of France, determining its future destiny. From that day forward, she was officially recognized as someone sent by God, capable of turning the tide of the bloody war and saving France from foreign invaders. Now, nothing stood in her way to begin fulfilling her great mission, assigned to her from above, and to lead the French army to liberate besieged Orleans and lead Charles VII to the solemn coronation in Reims. By the beginning of the year 1429, Orleans had become the true heart of the French resistance, the last important outpost holding northern France from complete capture by English troops. Located in a strategically important location on the banks of the Loire River, Orleans played a crucial role for both opposing sides. For the English, capturing Orleans meant the opportunity to freely invade central France and continue their advance southward, practically guaranteeing them complete control over the country and establishing their dominance on French soil. For the French, on the other hand, Orleans was the last barrier, the last hope, a wall separating them from final defeat, humiliation, and complete subjugation to the English. The city had been under siege by the English since October of 1428, steadfastly resisting the enemy's onslaught. English troops, commanded by experienced and ruthless leaders such as the Earl of Salisbury and later William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, surrounded Orleans with formidable fortifications, bastions, moats and palisades, completely cutting off access to the city by land and water. The English tactics were simple, brutal, and effective: to starve the city, gradually depleting its food supplies and cutting it off from the delivery of new provisions and military reinforcements. The city's garrison and its courageous inhabitants resisted desperately, but gradually their strength waned and hope for salvation dwindled with each passing day. Supplies of drinking water and food were inexorably running out, and various diseases caused by unsanitary conditions, acute food shortages, and the absence of basic medical supplies began to spread rapidly among the weakened population. Within the city walls, a grim atmosphere of ever-increasing despair, fear, and hopelessness prevailed. Although the defenders of Orleans tried to maintain outward resilience and show courage, panic, despondency, and a foreboding of imminent death inevitably spread among the exhausted inhabitants. People were forced to eat anything to somehow satisfy their hunger and survive in these inhumane conditions. Grain became a great rarity, and meat disappeared from the diet almost entirely, turning into an unattainable dream. The hungry residents of Orleans were forced to consume everything they could find, including roots, grass, tree bark, and even rats. The soldiers of Orleans, weakened by hunger and disease, grew weaker day by day, yet they repelled fierce attacks and daring raids by the English day and night, unwilling to surrender to the enemy. The city's fortifications, built many years ago, held together literally by a prayer and the incredible willpower of its heroic defenders, ready to give their lives for the freedom and independence of their homeland. The English felt so confident in their imminent triumph that they openly mocked the exhausted defenders of the city, trying to break their will to resist. Right under the walls of Orléans, they held noisy feasts, loudly celebrated their victories, ridiculed the French, and even held nightly tournaments, demonstrating their superiority. These provocative actions were part of a planned psychological war, aimed at finally breaking the morale of the defenders of Orléans, demoralizing them and accelerating their capitulation to the superior forces of the enemy. The situation in Orléans was so dire and hopeless that many influential advisors to Charles VII considered the city practically lost and saw no point in further fighting for it. In the Dauphin's entourage, heated debates continued about whether to try to save the city at any cost or to abandon it, accepting its inevitable fall and conserve the remaining resources and troops to defend the southern territories of France, which were still under Charles's control. Dauphin Charles VII himself was in a state of deep indecision, agonizing doubts, and constant vacillation, fully aware that the loss of Orléans would definitively discredit him in the eyes of the French people, undermine faith in his ability to govern the country, and completely destroy the morale of the French, depriving them of the will to resist. Meanwhile, the common people of France, anxiously following the tragic events unfolding around besieged Orléans, were in a state of deep despair, depression, and helplessness, seeing no way out of the situation. The city became not just an important military target, but also a symbol of national resistance and the struggle against foreign invaders. If Orléans fell, it would mean not only military defeat, but also the spiritual collapse of the entire country, the loss of hope for salvation, and the collapse of all ideals of freedom and independence. Residents of other cities, seeing the powerlessness of the French army and the indecisiveness of the king, could easily capitulate without a fight, preferring to submit to the conquerors rather than continue a pointless resistance. The English understood this perfectly well, and that is why they so persistently sought to seize the city, knowing that its fall would determine the fate of all of France. In this critical moment for the French, the sudden arrival of Joan of Arc became a completely unexpected, incredible, and fateful turn, changing the course of history. The very idea that a fragile and inexperienced peasant girl could influence the outcome of the war seemed absurd, ridiculous, and completely unbelievable in those days. But it was precisely thanks to this absurdity and Joan's own exceptional, unwavering faith in her mission that her sudden appearance made a stunning impression on French society and the exhausted army, breathing new hope into them. The news that Joan, a messenger of God, as she was called by the common people, was moving towards the city spread instantly among the exhausted defenders and starving residents of Orléans like lightning. Hungry, exhausted, desperate, and having lost all hope, people once again felt a surge of strength, saw a long-awaited sign that God had not abandoned them in their difficult hour and was ready to lend a helping hand. This unexpected return of faith in a miracle became almost a more powerful weapon than any troops, siege weapons, or combat machines that could have come to the aid of Orléans. Thus, Orléans, by the beginning of the year 1429, was not just a key strategic point on the map of the 100 Years' War, but also the place where the fate of an entire nation was being decided. The future of France and its place in world history was being determined. The city was on the very edge of the abyss, and its imminent fall would mean the collapse of all of France, plunging the country into chaos and anarchy. It was in this last minute of despair and hopelessness that Joan of Arc appeared, a fragile but strong-spirited woman who was destined to change the course of history, to inspire not only the exhausted soldiers of Orléans to a desperate struggle, but also the entire French people, awakening in them a thirst for freedom and independence. When Joan of Arc triumphantly entered Orléans on April 29th, 1429, the city had already been under a severe and bloody siege by English troops for about 7 long months, suffering from hunger, disease, and constant enemy attacks. The defenders of Orléans were completely exhausted by incessant fighting, famine, cold, and diseases that had claimed the lives of many residents. The English detachments, numbering about 5,000 men, under the command of such experienced and ruthless commanders as William de la Pole and John Talbot, were absolutely confident of their imminent victory and had no doubt that the city would fall in the very near future. They controlled nearly every approach to the city, erecting around Orléans an entire system of formidable and well-fortified structures, bastions, moats, palisades, and earthen ramparts, practically cutting it off from the outside world and preventing it from receiving reinforcements and supplies. The French themselves understood that without a miracle, without the intervention of divine forces, the city was doomed to inevitable downfall. The morale of Orléans' exhausted defenders was extremely low, and the hope of salvation had almost completely vanished. In this dramatic moment, the arrival of a young peasant girl, lacking any military experience or knowledge of the art of war, seemed absurd, utterly preposterous, and illogical. But Jeanne's sudden appearance was precisely the long-awaited miracle that the residents and soldiers of besieged Orléans, weary of suffering and despair, had secretly hoped for. Her words were simple, sincere, and convincing. "God has sent me to save the city from its enemies." The soldiers, worn down by endless defeats, losses, the deaths of their comrades, and the prevailing chaos, sensed that in Jeanne's person, the long-awaited hope for liberation from enemy oppression and the chance to regain freedom had finally arrived. One of Jeanne's first acts in besieged Orléans was to meet with the city's defense commanders to discuss a plan for future action. Among them were such experienced and renowned military leaders of the time as Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans, the celebrated Captain La Hire, Marshal Gilles de Rais, and other valiant commanders. Despite their initial skepticism, distrust, and even some disdain for the young woman who possessed no military experience, they were struck by her decisiveness, unwavering conviction in her own righteousness, and deep faith in divine providence. She immediately demanded that they abandon the defensive tactics that had yielded no results and immediately launch a decisive offensive against the English forces to drive them from French soil, which completely contradicted the cautious and measured advice of the experienced commanders who preferred to maintain a defensive posture. Her persistence, passionate conviction, and relentless energy made such a strong impression on the military leaders that they soon agreed to trust her and follow her advice, recognizing in her a talented leader and a wise strategist. Jeanne was always at the very heart of the battles, inspiring the soldiers by her example, but an interesting historical fact is that she never fought with weapons in hand or shed a drop of blood. Her sword, obtained at her request from the Church of St. Catherine in Fierbois, was more a symbol than a real combat instrument intended for killing enemies. According to historical accounts, Jeanne never used it in battle, preferring instead to hold a large battle standard, which served as her primary weapon. This white banner, adorned with gold-embroidered lilies, symbols of royal France, also bore the names of Jesus Christ and the Blessed Virgin Mary. Jeanne believed that her main purpose was not to kill enemies, but to inspire soldiers with her unwavering faith, unparalleled courage, spiritual strength, and boundless devotion to France. During the fierce battles, Jeanne, unafraid of death, was present in the most dangerous areas, waving her banner and encouraging the soldiers with her voice and example of personal courage, instilling in them confidence in victory. The soldiers recounted that her fearlessness, selflessness, and fervent belief in the righteousness of her cause inspired them to perform feats they could not have previously dared or even imagined. On one occasion, during a bloody assault on English fortifications, Jeanne was seriously wounded by an arrow in the shoulder, suffering a severe injury. However, after receiving first aid, she, overcoming the pain, rose to her feet again, grabbed her banner, and continued to inspire the warriors to further attacks, demonstrating incredible fortitude. The most decisive event in the siege of Orléans was the battle for Les Tourelles, a powerful English bastion located on the banks of the Loire River and considered virtually impregnable, reliably protected on all sides. On May 7, 1429, Jeanne personally led the decisive assault on the enemy fortress, setting an example of fearlessness and courage. The French soldiers, previously demoralized, exhausted, and convinced of their inevitable doom, now with extraordinary courage, fury, and desperate bravery, rushed at the enemy fortifications, unafraid of death. The English soldiers were so overwhelmed and demoralized by this sudden and fierce onslaught from the French that they failed to hold their positions and began to retreat in panic under the pressure of the inspired warriors. Les Tourelles fell under the onslaught of the French troops, and with it crumbled the English confidence that the city would soon surrender and that they would be able to seize it. The following day, May 8, 1429, the English army, having completely lost the initiative and morale, was forced to lift the siege and retreat in disgrace, suffering a crushing defeat. For all of France, this brilliant victory was a huge and momentous event, the first significant victory for the French troops in many years of bloody war. The people immediately proclaimed Jeanne the Maid of Orléans, and her fame and influence began to spread rapidly throughout the country, inspiring people to fight. The victory at Orléans became a turning point in the entire 100 Years' War and restored the French people's faith in the possibility of liberating the country from English occupation and restoring national independence. After the brilliant victory at Orléans, Jeanne was surrounded by universal respect, veneration, and love from ordinary people who saw in her the savior of France. But her style of conduct in battles remained unchanged. She never participated in bloodshed and never killed enemies personally. She maintained her role as a spiritual leader, chieftain, and inspirer of the French army, a person whose strength lay in unwavering faith, a personal example of courage and spiritual resilience, and whose banner became a symbol of liberation and the rebirth of France. After the decisive victory at Orléans, Jeanne d'Arc's reputation, authority, and influence skyrocketed. She became a true national heroine of France, but her mission was not limited to mere military successes. It was much broader and deeper. Jeanne's main and cherished goal was always to lead Dauphin Charles VII to the ancient city of Reims to officially crown him as the King of France in accordance with ancient traditions. This solemn coronation ceremony had enormous symbolic significance for the country, which ultimately became even more important than military successes on the battlefield and victories over the enemy. Reims was the traditional sacred site for the coronation of French monarchs, holding special symbolic significance. Since the time of Clovis, the first Frankish king to convert to Christianity, solemn ceremonies of anointing and crowning the monarch had taken place here. The French people believed that only the monarch who was crowned and anointed with holy oil in the majestic Reims Cathedral possessed the true and unquestionable right to rule and received a special blessing from God himself to govern the country. That is why Charles VII, who had not yet been crowned and bore only the title of Dauphin, was perceived by many French not as a full-fledged and legitimate monarch, but rather as a temporary claimant who had not yet confirmed his right to rule France and had not received divine approval. However, the path to Reims was extremely complex, dangerous, and thorny. The city was located far in the northeast of France, in territory controlled by the English allies, the Burgundians, which made travelling to it extremely risky and difficult. Many of Charles VII's experienced advisors considered the journey too risky, impractical, and even completely insane, warning the king against rash actions. But it was Jeanne who firmly insisted on the need for an immediate campaign to Reims, convincing the king and his hesitant entourage that this was not just a formal ceremony, but a key and decisive moment for uniting the country, strengthening royal power, and expelling enemies. Jeanne persistently argued that only after the solemn coronation in Reims Cathedral would the French people finally recognize Charles VII as the legitimate King of France, having received divine blessing, and would rally around him for a decisive and uncompromising struggle against the English invaders to liberate their land from foreign oppression. Her arguments were so convincing, logical and weighty, and her authority and prestige after the brilliant victory in Orléans so high, that Dauphin Charles finally agreed to this risky step, dismissing doubts and fears. On June 29, 1429, the French army, led by Jeanne d'Arc, set out on a long and dangerous campaign, later known as the Loire Campaign, and entered into history. The army led by Jeanne quickly and successfully advanced north, liberating important cities and fortresses along the way, many of which surrendered virtually without a fight, struck by Jeanne's fame and popularity, seeing in her the savior of France. Thanks to her inspiring presence and power of persuasion, many local nobles and cities, previously fearful of the consequences of openly opposing the powerful English and Burgundians, now without hesitation openly sided with the legitimate King Charles VII, recognizing his authority. Finally, on July 16, 1429, the French army under the command of Jeanne triumphantly reached Reims, overcoming all obstacles in its path. The city opened its gates almost without resistance to the army, welcoming the liberating warriors, inspired by the fame and unquestionable authority of Jeanne d'Arc, whom the common people idolized and considered a saint. The solemn coronation of Charles VII took place the next day, July 17th, in the majestic and beautifully decorated Reims Cathedral, in the presence of numerous nobles, high clergy, and ordinary citizens, rejoicing with happiness. This momentous occasion became a true triumph for all of France, symbolizing the long-awaited victory, the restoration of national pride, and the beginning of the country's revival from ruins. Jeanne d'Arc, dressed in shining armor and standing next to the altar during the ceremony, proudly held her famous banner, thereby emphasizing her enormous role in this historic event that changed the course of French history. Jeanne's presence at the coronation held a special symbolic significance. A simple peasant girl, never seeking personal glory, honors, or wealth, stood beside the king as a living symbol that Charles had received legitimate power by the will of God himself and through the heroic deeds of ordinary people, united in a just struggle for the freedom and independence of their country from enemy oppression. This long-awaited coronation not only significantly strengthened the authority of Charles VII, making him a fully fledged and universally recognized King of France, but also became a powerful symbol of the unification of the French people in the face of an external threat, inspiring them to continue their struggle. Now, no one doubted that Charles VII was the sole legitimate monarch of France, and that the English were invaders, usurpers, and enemies of the French people, subject to expulsion from the country. Thus, thanks to Jeanne d'Arc's firm resolve, unparalleled fearlessness, unwavering faith in her mission, and selfless devotion to France, the coronation of Charles VII in Reims became a turning point in the 100 Years' War, restoring the legitimacy of royal power, boosting the morale of the French troops, and inspiring the French to continue the tenacious and fierce struggle for the liberation of their native land from English dominion. From that momentous day, Jeanne d'Arc became not merely a national heroine of France, but a living symbol of a resurgent France, its hope and bright future. Following the solemn and long-awaited coronation of Charles VII in Reims, which marked the culmination of Jeanne d'Arc's triumphal march and the peak of her glory, an unexpected and tragic turning point arrived in her fate. It would seem that the young king should now unconditionally trust his savior and fully rely on her immense authority, support, and military experience. However, paradoxically, it was after this brilliant victory that relations between Jeanne d'Arc and Charles VII began to rapidly cool, gradually escalating into estrangement, distrust, and even open hostility. There were several reasons for this unexpected estrangement and deterioration in relations between the heroes, and they were all complex and multifaceted in nature. Firstly, after the solemn coronation in Reims, Charles VII felt much more confident in himself, his strengths, and his capabilities. Now, having officially become the legitimate King of France, receiving divine blessing for his reign, he began to feel independent of Jeanne's influence, believing that she had completed her mission and that he could now rule the country independently without needing anyone's help. Many influential courtiers felt that Jeanne, a simple peasant girl from the lower class, had gained too much influence on important matters of state and the king himself, which posed a threat to their own interests. The high-born aristocrats themselves, experienced advisors accustomed to complex intrigues and fierce political struggles, envied her immense popularity and feared her unquestioned authority among the common people and soldiers of the French army, fearing the loss of their influence over the king. Furthermore, after the brilliant victory at Orléans and the long-awaited coronation in Reims, Jeanne d'Arc persistently demanded the continuation of active and decisive actions against the English and their Burgundian allies, unwilling to rest on her laurels. She demanded that the offensive against the enemy be resumed immediately to liberate Paris, the capital of France, and other important cities under the control of the invaders. But there were people at the royal court who advocated a more cautious and less aggressive tactic, believing that military successes were already sufficient and that it was now necessary to consolidate what had been achieved, avoiding unnecessary risks and dangers. Charles VII, always cautious, prudent, and prone to doubt, gradually inclined towards the position of these courtiers, who believed that Jeanne's influence had become excessive and even dangerous for the stability of royal power. Her unyielding will, directness in judgment, and uncompromising nature in action began to irritate the king and his inner circle, who were accustomed to subtle political intrigues and diplomatic games. As a result, the young king stopped actively supporting her military initiatives aimed at liberating France and began to listen more and more to the advice of those courtiers who considered Jeanne a dangerous figure, capable of undermining their own influence on state affairs and depriving them of power. This distancing did not manifest itself immediately, but gradually, but soon became perfectly obvious to Jeanne d'Arc herself. She was increasingly not invited to important military councils, her requests for new military operations were ignored or rejected, and the king himself began to avoid personal meetings with her as if fearing her influence. For Jeanne, who sincerely believed that her mission was the complete and final liberation of France from English domination, such an attitude from the king and his courtiers became a severe trial, a painful disappointment, and a heavy blow. An interesting historical fact lies in how the solemn ceremony of Charles VII's coronation in Reims took place, and what unusual rituals were used to confirm the legitimacy of the new monarch in the eyes of the people. The French coronation tradition was closely linked to religious rites, and the entire ceremony had a deep spiritual meaning, symbolizing divine blessing for ruling the country. In addition to the classic rite of anointing with holy chrism, brought from the sacred ampulla, which, according to legend, was sent from heaven by an angel to baptize Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks, there were other, no less interesting rituals. One of the most unusual and memorable rites was a special symbolic act when several noble representatives of the clergy and aristocracy publicly confirmed before the people gathered in the cathedral that they recognized Charles as the legitimate and rightful monarch of France who had received power from God. These chosen individuals addressed the people with special speeches and asked solemn questions. "Do you recognize this man as your lawful king and ruler?" The people had to publicly give their approval, recognition, and consent, loudly shouting in response, "Yes, we recognize him." This important ritual had immense symbolic significance, as it emphasized the unity of the people, clergy, and aristocracy in recognizing the monarch, their shared desire for peace and prosperity of the country. Another interesting moment of the ceremony was the ancient tradition of presenting the new king with special symbolic regalia, such as a sword, spurs, crown, and scepter, which conveyed to the new monarch not only power over the country, but also enormous responsibility for protecting the people and the church from any enemies. Charles VII received these sacred attributes from the hands of the highest church hierarchs, which meant his obligation to God to protect France and the Catholic faith from any external and internal threats. Thus, the coronation itself was a powerful symbol of the unity of the French people and their monarch, their shared faith and devotion to their country. But despite this unity and universal rejoicing at the moment of triumph, the subsequent distancing of the king from Jeanne d'Arc and the cooling of their relations became one of the most dramatic and tragic episodes of her short but bright life, leading subsequently to the sad and unjust end of her heroic mission. After relations between Jeanne d'Arc and Charles VII began to deteriorate, she found herself in an extremely difficult and uncertain situation, effectively deprived of the support of the king and his court. Despite this, Jeanne was not going to abandon her sacred mission entrusted to her by God. Her main goal remained the complete liberation of France from the English invaders and their treacherous Burgundian allies, who were doing everything possible to prevent the unification of the country. It was with this noble thought and firm intention to fulfill her duty that she set out on a military campaign to the north, to the lands occupied by the troops of the Duke of Burgundy, a loyal ally of the English. In the spring of 1430, Jeanne d'Arc was in Compiègne, a strategically important city located on the banks of the Oise River. This city was a key point in the French defense system against the troops of the Duke of Burgundy and the English, who were seeking to regain their lost positions and stop the successful French offensive inspired by Jeanne's victories. On May 23, 1430, the fateful battle took place, becoming a tragic turning point in the fate of Jeanne d'Arc and predetermining her sad end. On that day, Jeanne, along with a small but brave detachment of warriors, left the fortress of Compiègne, trying to launch a surprise attack on the positions of the Burgundians in order to demoralize the enemy. The plan was quite simple: to inflict a swift and unexpected blow on the Burgundian positions, sow panic in their ranks, demoralize the enemy, and push them away from the walls of the city in order to protect Compiègne from enemy attack. But in the course of this daring sortie, everything did not go as planned, and circumstances turned out extremely unfavorable for Jeanne and her detachment. The Burgundian soldiers turned out to be better prepared and organized than expected, and were ready for a possible French attack. The French detachment, led by Jeanne, encountered much stronger and fiercer resistance than anticipated, and was forced to retreat back to the gates of Compiègne under the pressure of superior enemy forces. It was at this critical moment that a fatal mistake occurred, which cost Jeanne her freedom. For an unclear and still controversial reason, the city gates suddenly closed right in front of Jeanne herself and her closest associates, cutting them off from the saving refuge. This prevented Jeanne's detachment from taking shelter inside the fortress behind its massive walls and made it impossible to escape from the pursuing enemies who were hot on their heels. Jeanne and a small detachment of her loyal supporters were literally trapped between the closed city gates and the pursuing Burgundian soldiers, unable to either escape or hide from the enemy. The battle was brief, but fierce and bloody. Despite a desperate and heroic resistance, Joan was captured by a Burgundian soldier, a crossbowman named Lionel of Vendôme, who became her jailer. The question of why the gates of Compiègne suddenly closed just as Joan was returning to the city is one of the most mysterious, enigmatic, and controversial episodes of her life, giving rise to numerous theories and speculations. Some historians and researchers believe it was simply a fateful accident, a tragic mistake, or an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by general panic, confusion, and a lack of coordination among the city's defenders, who failed to open the gates in time for Joan's returning force. Others, however, believe that Joan may have been the victim of a carefully planned and treacherous trap set by her many political adversaries, including French courtiers who secretly conspired with the enemy and wished to get rid of a figure who was too influential, popular, and inconvenient for them, hindering their selfish goals. These suspicions are supported by the fact that, after Joan's capture, none of the French commanders made any serious or active attempts to free her from captivity or ransom her from the Burgundians, although such opportunities certainly existed and could have been realized. King Charles VII, in essence, stood aside, doing almost nothing to save her, as if wishing to get rid of his savior. This inaction caused contemporaries and later historians alike a great deal of questioning, justifiable suspicion, and bitter disappointment. Thus, Joan of Arc's last battle at Compiègne remains one of the most enigmatic, tragic, and ambiguous pages of her life, full of secrets and unsolved mysteries. Whether it was a tragic accident, a fateful military error, or the result of deliberate betrayal is a question that still does not have a single, universally accepted answer and continues to spark debate among researchers. One thing is clear. Joan's capture opened the door to the last, most tragic and agonizing stage of her life, culminating in a shameful trial, an unfair sentence, and a cruel execution that forever made her one of the most dramatic, controversial, and tragic figures in world history. After Joan was captured outside the walls of Compiègne, the French people and army expected an immediate and decisive reaction from King Charles VII and his inner circle, believing they would make every effort to free her. It seemed perfectly obvious that the monarch should use all the resources and opportunities at his disposal to release as soon as possible the heroine who had played a key role in his coronation and the salvation of France from utter collapse and imminent doom, who had become a national symbol. However, exactly the opposite happened. Charles VII and his entourage did almost nothing to save Joan from enemy captivity, showing a remarkable indifference to her fate. The main reason for this strange and inexplicable behavior lay in the complex and convoluted political situation at the French court, which had a huge influence on all decisions made. After the ceremonial coronation, Charles VII felt confident enough on the throne to listen to those courtiers who had been suspicious of Joan from the very beginning and saw her as an obstacle to power and a threat to their own influence over the king. These powerful people envied her boundless popularity among the people and soldiers of the French army, feared her rapidly growing authority, and considered her a dangerous figure capable of shaking their own position at court and even overthrowing the king himself, replacing him with their own puppet. They did everything they could to convince Charles VII that further support for Joan no longer made any sense and was even extremely dangerous for the stability of the country, as it could lead to undesirable and unnecessary conflicts with England and Burgundy, with whom many influential figures at court dreamed of concluding a compromise peace in order to end the bloody war. The role of Burgundy, with its enormous influence and wealth, was particularly important and significant in this complex political game. At that time, Duke Philip III the Good, ruler of the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, formally remained an ally of the English and sided with them in the war, but in reality, he pursued his own political and economic interests, skillfully maneuvering between the opposing sides and benefiting from the situation. When Joan of Arc unexpectedly fell into the hands of the Burgundians, the Duke quickly realized that he had acquired an invaluable tool for political bargaining, which could be used to his advantage. He knew perfectly well how high Joan's symbolic value was for both the English and the French, and therefore decided to get the most out of this situation and extract as much profit from it as possible. As a result, the Burgundians put Joan up for sale as a valuable prisoner, announcing that they would sell her to the highest bidder. The English instantly became interested in such a unique opportunity, understanding its importance and prospects. For them, the capture of Joan of Arc was an incredible stroke of luck, like a gift from fate, because the girl, considered a living symbol of French resistance and the inspiration of the army, could not only be neutralized and disarmed, but also used as a powerful weapon to discredit the legitimate King Charles VII and undermine the French people's trust in him. The English understood perfectly well that a public and demonstrative trial of Joan and her subsequent execution could inflict a powerful and crushing blow to French national identity, morale, and the will to further resistance, weakening the country. As a result, the deal between the English and the Burgundians was concluded quite quickly and on very favorable terms for the Duke. He got what he wanted. The English paid an enormous sum of money for Joan of Arc at the time, 10,000 livres tournois, which was a huge fortune. To understand the scale of this impressive sum, It is worth noting that this money could have supported a large military detachment for several months, providing the warriors with everything they needed. Such a high price was explained not so much by the military or economic significance of the prisoner as by her enormous symbolic and political importance, which she represented for both sides of the conflict. Joan was the living embodiment of French patriotism, courage, defiance, and selfless struggle for the freedom and independence of the country. Her name was known in every French village, and her capture would be a devastating moral and psychological blow for the French, depriving them of hope. Having paid this enormous price, the English immediately transported Joan to Rouen, the center of their possessions in the occupied French lands, where she was to appear before a pre-planned and biased ecclesiastical court, organized with the active support and under the complete control of the English authorities, who craved her death. The main goal of this shameful trial was to prove that Joan was a heretic, a witch, a sorceress, and a servant of the devil, in order to completely destroy her reputation, debunk her heroic image, and thereby undermine the authority of the French King Charles VII, whom she had elevated to the throne. Thus, the main reasons why no one saved Joan and did not try to ransom her from enemy captivity were the cynical court intrigues at the court of Charles VII, the fear of the king and his entourage of complicating relations with powerful Burgundy and England, as well as the banal desire of Burgundy to sell such a valuable and sought-after prisoner as profitably as possible, receiving a huge sum of money for her. This shameful deal and the subsequent inquisitorial trial of Joan of Arc became one of the darkest and most inglorious episodes of the 100 Years' War, forever leaving an indelible shadow on the reputation of the cowardly King Charles VII and his self-serving entourage, who betrayed their savior for personal gain. After Joan of Arc fell into the hands of the English, she was immediately taken to the city of Rouen, which was the center of English power and their main stronghold in the occupied French lands. There she was to stand trial, which went down in history as the Rouen trial, a symbol of injustice and political repression. This sad event was one of the most shameful and cynical episodes of the bloody 100 Years' War, and became a prime example of how justice can be grossly distorted and used for political purposes to achieve selfish goals. The Rouen trial began in January of 1431. The court was officially ecclesiastical, headed by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man closely associated with the English administration in its service and completely under its control. In reality, the whole process was a carefully organized and staged production, the main goal of which was not to establish the truth and achieve justice, but to discredit Joan of Arc as much as possible, debunk her heroic image, and declare her a heretic, a sorceress, a servant of the devil, and an enemy of the Catholic Church. Joan of Arc was accused of a number of serious crimes, the main one being heresy, that is, a conscious departure from official church doctrine, denial of the dogmas of the Catholic faith, and the spread of false ideas capable of misleading believers. Other important and serious charges brought against her were practicing witchcraft, wearing men's clothing, which was considered a serious sin, a violation of accepted moral norms, and an encroachment on the divine order established by the church canons of the time, disobedience to church authorities, and false claims of receiving revelations directly from God, which had not been confirmed by the church. They tried in every way to present Joan as a dangerous witch, a servant of the devil, an instrument in the hands of dark forces who deliberately misled ordinary people and violated the sacred foundations of the church, undermining its authority and power. Throughout the trial, the judges employed a multitude of cunning tricks, devious ploys, and psychological manipulations, all in an attempt to confuse Joan, to force her into making a mistake, to incriminate herself, or to elicit a statement that could be interpreted as an admission of guilt or a renunciation of her beliefs. For instance, she was posed exceedingly complex, convoluted, and insidious theological questions, answers to which were virtually impossible for a simple, illiterate peasant girl lacking any formal theological education. Nevertheless, Joan astonished the judges with her clarity of thought, incredible resilience, strength of character, and her ability to provide simple, clear, and convincing answers, avoiding the traps set for her and brilliantly deflecting all their arguments. Another common and underhanded tactic was the deliberate falsification, distortion, or arbitrary interpretation of her words in the court records, which were maintained with numerous irregularities. Joan's testimonies were recorded in Latin, a language she did not understand at all, allowing the judges to interpret her words in a light favorable to their cause, attributing to her things she had never said. Furthermore, Joan was categorically denied legal counsel, a defender, or any form of legal assistance, even though, according to ecclesiastical law, she was fully entitled to qualified legal aid and the advice of a spiritual mentor who could have helped her defend herself against unjust accusations. One of the most insidious and hypocritical traps involved the issue of her male attire, which became a central point of contention. Joan wore male clothing purely for safety reasons, to avoid violence, insults, harassment, and humiliation in the prison environment, where she was surrounded by male guards. But the judges deliberately used this fact against her, as evidence of her sinfulness, heresy, licentiousness, defiance of the church, and disregard for established rules, emphasizing that she was intentionally violating the laws of the church, refusing to correct her behavior and wallowing in sin. Despite all these artifices, treacherous traps, psychological pressure, and constant threats, Joan maintained herself with remarkable dignity, unwavering faith, and courage, never losing her composure. She steadfastly insisted that all her actions were solely for the benefit of France, and that she performed them at the direct command of God, obeying divine will. However, realizing that the trial was not progressing as smoothly as planned, and that Joan had no intention of admitting guilt, the judges decided to employ a final, more potent method: brutal psychological pressure and the direct threat of an agonizing death penalty by burning at the stake in an attempt to break her will. Finally, on May 24, 1431, Joan was tricked into signing a document in which she formally confessed guilt to certain charges, promising henceforth never to wear male clothing again, and to stop claiming that she received instructions from God, thus renouncing her convictions. However, several days later, after she was forced to wear male clothing again, possibly because she had no other clothes, or she was deliberately deprived of her female garments, creating a hopeless situation, the judges declared that she had violated her repentance and returned to her former heresy, thereby deserving severe punishment. This gave them the opportunity to deliver the final and irrevocable sentence, death by burning at the stake, which was intended as a lesson to everyone else. On May 30, 1431, Joan of Arc was cruelly executed in the Old Market Square in Rouen, in the presence of a huge crowd of people gathered to witness this horrific scene. She died with remarkable dignity, unwavering faith, astounding courage, and incredible strength of spirit, continuing to insist on her innocence and repeating the name of Jesus until the very last moment of her life. Later, after 25 long years, this shameful trial was officially declared illegal, unjust, unlawful, and fabricated, and Joan of Arc was fully rehabilitated, her name was cleared of slander, and she was found innocent. But back then, in 1431, her tragic and martyred death was the result of one of the most unfair, cynical, cruel, and disgraceful trials in the history of medieval Europe, entering the annals of history as a symbol of lawlessness. After the judges, acting on the will of the English authorities, found Joan of Arc guilty of repeatedly violating the promises she had made during the trial, they finally and irrevocably sentenced her to a torturous death penalty by burning at the stake, hoping that her death would serve as a warning to other French people. Joan's last days before her execution were among the most tragic, agonizing, and emotionally challenging moments of her short life, but also the most vivid and compelling testimonies to her unwavering strength of spirit, high human dignity, Christian humility, and boundless faith in God. In these final days, she was held in solitary confinement in a prison in Rouen, under strict and continuous surveillance by English soldiers awaiting the execution of the sentence. Despite the dire and inhuman conditions of detention, constant psychological pressure, relentless humiliation, mockery, and the threat of imminent and agonizing death, Joan demonstrated amazing resilience, astonishing courage, Christian humility, and boundless faith in God. Witnesses to those tragic events recalled that she often prayed, spoke quietly and calmly with her guards and priests, never showed signs of despair, panic, or fear, did not complain about her fate, and did not lose clarity of thought, remaining true to her convictions. Before the execution itself, she was visited by priests, trying to convince her once again to confess her guilt, renounce her beliefs, and thus save her immortal soul from eternal torment in hell. However, Joan steadfastly refused any confessions that contradicted her true beliefs, emphasizing that she would never compromise her conscience or betray God. She insisted on her complete innocence, vehemently denying all the charges against her, and asserted that everything she had done in her life was the fulfillment of divine will and was solely for the benefit of France, its protection from enemies, and its liberation from foreign oppression. Her courageous and dignified behavior in the face of imminent death shocked even many of her enemies and caused some judges and witnesses to feel shame, remorse, and regret for what they had done, realizing the full injustice of what was happening. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the Old Market Square in Rouen, where a tall pyre was erected, prepared for her burning. Despite the obvious cruelty and inhumanity of the punishment, she ascended to the place of execution with incredible calm, unwavering dignity, Christian humility, and firm faith in God, repeatedly uttering the name of Jesus Christ and invoking his help in the last moments of her life. Her last words before death were sincere prayers and a passionate plea to God, in whom she sought solace. This tragic and majestic scene deeply impressed all eyewitnesses to the execution, among whom were not only her enemies, cruel judges, and English soldiers, but also the ordinary residents of Rouen, many of whom wept and grieved, realizing the injustice and monstrosity of what was happening, sympathizing with the heroic girl. But why was Joan of Arc condemned specifically for heresy, and not for any political or military crimes of which she could also have been accused? The fact is that the charge of heresy was the most effective and convenient way to finally eliminate her influence, completely destroy her reputation, and forever defame her name. If Joan had been tried simply for participating in military operations and battles, she could well have been perceived as a heroine, a patriot, and a martyr, inspiring the French people to further resist the English invaders. However, the accusation of heresy meant that the Catholic Church itself, with its enormous authority and influence, recognized her as a criminal against God, which severely undermined her moral authority and automatically cast a shadow on the legitimacy of King Charles VII, whom she had brought to power. The decisive and formal reason for issuing the death sentence was the absurd charge of repeatedly wearing male clothing, although this was just a contrived pretext. Although today this accusation seems absurd, ridiculous, insignificant, and trivial, in the 15th century it was taken extremely seriously by the Church and was of enormous importance. Male clothing on women was considered a gross violation of the order established by the Church, a sin against the natural laws of nature, a violation of gender roles, and a sign of blasphemy. And after Joan found herself in male clothing again, this served as a formal reason to finally accuse her of heresy and returning to the sin from which she had supposedly already renounced by signing the agreement. Thus, this formal accusation was used by the judges as a decisive argument for her conviction and sentencing to death, although it was completely contrived. In reality, the genuine reason for Joan's imprisonment and execution lay not in clothing or even in religious matters, but in the political and symbolic significance of Joan of Arc herself, whose elimination became the main goal of the English and their treacherous allies seeking to weaken France. Joan of Arc's courageous and dignified behavior before her execution and the obvious injustice of the harsh sentence passed on her soon turned her in the eyes of ordinary people into a national heroine, a symbol of resistance, and a martyr whose death inspired the French people to ultimate victory in the 100 Years' War, and forever left a profound mark on the history of France and all of humankind. 25 long years after the tragic execution of Joan of Arc in the year 1456, a new trial began, known in history as the Rehabilitation Trial, the purpose of which was to review Joan's case and deliver a fair verdict. This trial was an entirely unusual and rare event for that time, as it completely overturned the sentence previously handed down by the ecclesiastical court, which was extremely atypical for medieval justice. But why did the Church and the King of France, after so many years, decide to return to the question of Joan of Arc's guilt or innocence and re-examine all the circumstances of her case? In reality, the decision to conduct the rehabilitation trial of Joan of Arc had primarily political motives, and not a desire for justice, as it might seem at first glance. By the mid-15th century, the political situation in France had fundamentally changed, and the French kingdom had significantly strengthened. The 100 Years' War was coming to its logical conclusion. The English had been almost completely driven out of French territory, and the authority and influence of King Charles VII had increased significantly. He had become a strong monarch. In these favorable political conditions, Joan of Arc no longer posed any threat to the French aristocracy, influential courtiers, and the high clergy, and her name and image could be used to advantage to strengthen the shaken authority of King Charles VII, increase his popularity among the people, and unite French society. In addition, the inquisitorial court that condemned Joan of Arc had long been perceived by French society as extremely unfair, biased, politically motivated, and fabricated, and her cruel execution as a shameful page in the history of the French Church and monarchy, which had irreparably damaged their reputation. Many reasonable representatives of the high clergy and secular authorities perfectly understood that the condemnation of Joan of Arc had seriously damaged the reputation of the Catholic Church, undermined the people's trust in the French crown, and cast a shadow over all of French society. Joan's rehabilitation would restore historical justice, remove the undeserved stain of shame from the Church's authority, prove its infallibility, and show that France had finally freed itself from the influence of English invaders, their treacherous allies, and supporters who betrayed the interests of their country. The rehabilitation process of Joan of Arc itself was carried out very carefully, scrupulously, and in detail, with the observance of all legal formalities, which emphasized its importance and seriousness. Dozens of witnesses were interviewed, ranging from ordinary soldiers, peasants, and residents of Orleans to high-ranking military leaders, experienced advisors to the king, and influential priests. All of them unanimously confirmed Joan's honesty, sincerity, piety, unwavering faith in God, and exceptional services to the French people. As a result of a lengthy and comprehensive investigation, on July 7, 1456, the ecclesiastical court in Rouen officially recognized that the previous trial of Joan was illegal, conducted with gross violations, and the sentence passed on her was unfair, unfounded, and unlawful. Joan of Arc herself was unanimously found not guilty of all the absurd and far-fetched charges previously brought against her. All materials from the previous disgraceful trial, fabricated interrogation records, and slanderous testimonies were solemnly and publicly destroyed as proof of lies and injustice. After the official rehabilitation, a new stage began in the history of shaping the image of Joan of Arc in the minds of the French. From a symbol of heresy, sin, and disobedience, condemned to death, she transformed into a national heroine of France, a holy martyr, and the embodiment of the best qualities of the French people, becoming the personification of courage, resilience, patriotism, spiritual strength, selfless devotion to her homeland, and self-sacrifice in the name of higher ideals. Over time, her personality acquired truly legendary features. Her biography became overgrown with numerous myths and legends, and her life and heroic deeds became one of the main symbols of French history, national pride, and an object of admiration. In the year 1920, Joan of Arc was officially canonized by the Catholic Church as the heavenly patron saint of France for her services to faith and the people. An interesting historical fact lies in how the name of Joan of Arc has been used for centuries for political purposes by various generations of French people, depending on their views. In different eras, her heroic image was adapted to completely different political views, ideologies, and group interests, often opposite to each other. For example, during the time of the Great French Revolution of the 18th century, Joan of Arc was depicted as a symbol of the struggle of the common people against foreign intervention and monarchical tyranny, defending the ideals of freedom, equality, and fraternity. In the era of Napoleon Bonaparte, she became an inspiring image, calling the French to patriotism, national unity, and cohesion in the face of external threats and enemy invasion. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the image of Joan of Arc was actively used by representatives of various political movements and parties, from monarchists to republicans, from conservatives to socialists, each of whom saw in her a reflection of their own ideas. During the First and Second World Wars, the name and heroic image of Joan of Arc became important elements of French propaganda, symbolizing national unity, resilience, courage, and resistance to foreign invaders, inspiring soldiers to defend their homeland. Even today, numerous political parties, public organizations, and social movements in France often turn to the image of Joan of Arc, emphasizing her as the embodiment of those values and ideas that they want to convey to society, winning the support of voters. Thus, the tragic and heroic fate of Joan of Arc, her selflessness, bravery, unwavering faith, and love for her homeland continue to have a huge impact on the public consciousness of the French, shaping their national identity and sense of patriotism. The rehabilitation of Joan, her subsequent transformation into a saint and national heroine of France, her canonization forever secured Joan of Arc an honorable place among the most outstanding and inspiring figures, not only in French history, but also in world history.